Hello PayPal, Dublin and Dundalk. My name is Steve. As it's nearly World Honeybee Day, the PayPal events team have asked me to give you a bit of a virtual tour of my bees. I run Swarm Study E, which is the allegedly largest network of honeybee rescuers in the world. And what I want to show you today is some of my rescued bees. So every hive I have here in my garden in Kildare, a few more over there, these are all rescued bees, and they either come from handy swarms that were taken off a bush, or they've been taken out of chimneys or out of roofs or all number of other places. So the bees I keep here, I don't keep for honey production. So they're not the prettiest bees in the world, they're not the best bees in the world. And what I'm looking for is survival. These guys have survived by themselves, unaided by humans, and I'm trying to replicate that and keep them going. We're going to have a look in 3 of the hives, 2 of them that are good and 1 of them that has a problem, which is common at this time of year, and we'll explain what we see. And you basically get a first person point of view of what a beekeeper will see as they inspect their hives. So this won't substitute for a beginner's course, but it's hopefully an interesting introduction to the idea of maybe becoming a beekeeper by maybe taking up a course down the line. I hope you enjoy, and thanks for watching. Before we lash into the beehives, let's have a bare bones crash course in beekeeping so we know what we're looking at. First, what does a honeybee look like? A lot of people think this is a honeybee, but it's actually a bumblebee. They can sting lots of times, but these guys are in trouble, unfortunately. This yellow guy is a wasp. They eat bugs. Avoid going near their nests, they can really hurt. Now for the lady of the hour, the worker honeybee. In Ireland they are a dark colour. There are 3 castes of honeybee: the female worker, the female queen and the male drone. You've probably seen plenty of workers in your garden over the years, but the drones and the queens are harder to spot. The queens rarely leave the hive. The queen has a very long abdomen because she lays up to 1,500 eggs a day with it. The worker, as the name suggests, they basically do all the work in the colony. They make the honey and they raise the babies. The drone allegedly only has one job, and that's to mate. Human-made hives are based around the frame. There are lots of sizes of frames, which have different purposes. The frame is a movable portion of comb that the bees use for storing food and raising young. Beekeepers can manipulate hives by moving around these frames. Typically, the smallest colony will be a 6-frame nuke. We use nukes before the colony is big enough to go into a full-sized hive. A nuke is just big enough to overwinter. We'd be hoping to have 4 frames of bees and 2 frames of stores to get through the winter. A nuke has a roof and a floor, and the parts are not stuck together. Once the colony is big enough, they go into a full hive, typically a 10-frame box. The bigger part of the box is for the brood, called the brood box. Another box above that, for the honey stores, is called a super. And then we have a rain-proof roof for protection. When we go to look at the frames in our hives, what we are expecting to see is honey in this region generally. Honey is their carbohydrate source, their energy. We will see pollen sometimes in this region, but it's not a hard and fast rule. Pollen is their protein. And we'll hopefully see worker brood somewhere like this. If you have a really strong queen, you might have a solid frame of brood. That queen is a keeper. Bees can sting, and they die when this happens, so to prevent stings, we are going to wear our gloves and our bee suit. We use a smoker to pacify them, and we use this pry bar called a hive tool to pull the frames out. The bee suit is like PayPal buyer protection. You probably won't get stung if you do everything right, but it's just nice to have that sense of security that you won't get stung so you can get on with it. Let's go see these bees. It's a pretty windy day, but it's warm. It's not a good idea to go near bees in bad weather. It's much easier on nice days as they're too busy to notice you. Before I open the hive, I'm going to smoke around the hives. The smoke encourages them to consume honey, and like after a big meal, you have less energy to get off the couch. It's kind of like this here. Next, we take the roof off and place it on the ground upside down. This plastic sheet here is what we call a crown board. It stops the bees from gluing the top frames to the roof. This first box, the super, is here for the ivy harvest, which is the last nectar source of the season. The bees haven't yet built the comb yet, but in 6 weeks this will be fully built and full of ivy honey, hopefully. What you can see here is a starter strip of wax that I've added to the frame for the bees to build on. It's like a guide. Most beekeepers use full sheet of wax called foundation, but I like to use these strips instead, as I know I have pure beeswax around the strip. The whole box looks the same, so let's move on to the first brood box. This outermost frame is just being started. That's okay, nothing to see here yet. Our first proper frame here is being built a bit wonky, but it's full of nectar. Nectar comes from flowers and has lots of water in it. The bees will evaporate the water content down and turn it into honey. You can see the nectar glistening in the sun. This is their winter food stores. This particular frame might end up holding 2 kilograms of honey. This next frame is still being worked on, but we have something new. This greyish coloured material, this is called bee bread. It is chewed pollen and it is the bee's protein and nutrient source. Our next frame shows us something interesting. The downward domes. These are called play cups. Play cups might be the start of a baby queen, but a lot of the time they remain unused. Higher up on the frame we have capped worker brood in the centre of the comb. In here are developing worker bees. Surrounding them are freshly laid eggs, so we know a queen was here less than 1 day ago. That's a great sign. These single capped cells on the left, these are drone cells. At this time of year you won't be seeing many drone babies being raised. The nurse bees on this frame are busy cleaning out the cells and feeding the eggs and larvae until the babies are due to be capped. We use the smoker to reveal what's under the bees. My trick for finding the queen is to not look at anything in particular, and she just sometimes stands out. I'm really good at not finding the queen with this method. Here on this frame, more capped brood, which is the tan yellow colour. The white capped area is the stored honey. There is no sign of prevalent disease in these bees, but there is plenty more of the play cups at the bottom. Here's more capped brood and larvae, some pollen and some capped honey. These bees are definitely not going to starve anytime soon. I don't feed my bees sugar syrup as is common. These bees have done this all by themselves. This frame is mainly nectar. If the weather was perfect for a week, they could fill this entire hive. But this is Ireland, so low chance of that. On to the next brood box. This end frame is fresh beeswax that's been discoloured by pollen. That's been turned into bee bread in the grey coloured cells. If you want to grow lots of bees, you need lots of pollen. There is a tiny area here of larvae being fed, and if you look very closely, you might be able to see that most of these bees are drones. Another frame of brood, the empty cells, have likely hatched already, and the rest will be following suit shortly. Here we can see the odd drone cell with the raised domes. These are raised because the drones need more space than the workers to develop in. Over here, this red stuff, this is propolis. Bees use this as a disinfectant and a glue. In this frame, the bees appear to be cleaning out the cells, preparing them for new eggs. Here's what we like to see, a good pattern of capped brood. We haven't seen the queen, but she's the best one I have. So that's our first hive inspected, and I am very happy with them. There's no actions to take. On a strong hive, it's important not to leave any gaps, or the bees will fill the gaps with comb. So we tightly insert the frames, leaving no extra space. Then we carefully return the next brood box and our empty super. Then we place the crown board and the roof, and the job is done. On to hive number 2, our queenless hive. The queen is a hugely important part of the hive, as you will see here. She's like the algorithm in PayPal that routes transactions to the right place. Without the algorithm, the system breaks down. This was my best hive last season, but they swarmed on me a few weeks ago and have not yet recovered, so let's investigate. Without a laying queen, you begin to lose worker numbers, and if you don't have sufficient worker numbers, you won't have honey storage. Just like if there are not enough merchants on eBay selling items, you're not going to be getting commissions to cover operating costs and make a profit, or in this case, winter honey stores. Our first frame, nothing really going on, and there is nothing in the cells, at least not here. The darker brown cells were full of brood a few weeks ago. Brood makes the wax get dark like this. This frame has a splash of drone brood. Drone brood takes a few days longer to hatch than workers, so we can conclude there was worker brood in these cells in the last few days. When this hive swarmed, it took with it as much honey as it could bring, and maybe 50% of the bees from this hive. Then the weather was poor for the last few weeks, which makes the problem of this hive recovering all the harder. I'm looking for signs of day-old eggs, which are not obvious, but there is bee bread at least. This unfinished frame has some capped honey and some bee bread. I'd like to see a lot more stored honey in this hive. This hive has 4 boxes on it, which are now 3 boxes too many. Before September, I will reduce this hive down to 1 brood box for overwintering. If we solve the queen issue, that is. The hive tool is fantastic at prying out the frames, as it's quite difficult just using your fingers. This frame, no eggs, no nectar, no bee bread, nothing. The last frame has a tiny starter strip on it. Foundation was in short supply this year, so it had to be economical. So far it's not looking great, in fact it's terrible. Let's see what's in the upper brood box with our fingers crossed for something more positive. Now this is what we want to see. This is a queen cell. In here is a developing queen that just might save this colony. I'm holding the frame up to the light to see if it's hollow. If it's not, then there should be a queen in here. Queen cells are huge as the queen is the longest member of the hive, and they look a lot like peanuts. Another surprise. Here is a queen cell that has already emerged. The bottom of the cell has been cut open. That's a great sign, but it might take up to a month for a baby queen to start laying eggs. The hardest thing to learn with bees is patience. If we allow it, nature usually will find a way. Onto the bottom brood box. We learn an important lesson. Don't let your smoker burn out. You seem to always need your smoker the minute it goes out. With a few squeezes, we get it back to normal. The last interesting point in this hive is a mistake I made. I put the wrong frame in this box, and the bees just went ahead and made it the right size. The reason why this hive is not doing great is because they swarmed a few weeks ago, and I managed to get it on video. They decided 50 foot up this tree was a good place to relax for a bit. Bucket on a stick time. If I can get the queen in the bucket, the rest should follow. Here is that same swarm after 20 minutes. All the flying bees collected inside. It's just a waiting game. Once you have a swarm, it's just a matter of popping them into a new hive. Now onto our last hive, which is a top bar hive. These hive designs are good if you have a bad back, as supers can be very heavy. Right here at the entrance we have our hive hacker, the wasp, who is trying to get in to steal the honey. If unchecked, they will kill the colony. The hive has small entrances, so our guard bees can make a good defence. Bees can check who's coming into the hive, a bit like the know your customer checks. We don't want scammers in our systems. In a top bar hive we don't use frames, but these lengths of wood. The bees make the honeycomb themselves, and we don't give them any starter strips like in the hives we've already looked at. Next, I'm breaking the propolis seals, as they are glued pretty tightly. On our first decent frame we have some nectar. The honey is located at the back of the hive, so the wasps have to go right in to get at it. Closer to the door we have the brood and the eggs. So far so good. More brood and more eggs. These guys are trucking along. This last frame has more larvae and lots of bee bread. Right in the middle of the frame we can see a queen cup. Now it's time to put it all back together. It would help if we put it back in the right direction. You saw a big swarm in a tree, now here's a tiny swarm, about a mug full of bees. I popped this into my bucket, and while I was looking at them, look who showed herself. It's Her Majesty right there in the middle. Here is one last swarm from this summer. This one was barely an inconvenience to collect. These are the ones we like. When everything works out, they just march themselves inside. All you do is wait. I have a few questions that you guys have sent in for me to answer. I'll answer them as best I can. So, first question, Sarah asks, tips to keeping bees on a balcony. So, now, for the work that I do, which is responding to bees in weird places, I'm not a big fan of the idea of bees being kept in urban environments, especially by beginners. I think it's more difficult than it's worth the effort of. If you're a beginner, like for the first kind of 3 years, you probably don't want to be putting bees in a place like a city. And the reason is that if you're not on top of your swarm prevention, which will happen in April, May, June, you'll end up with bees leaving. So that's your investment gone, it's your honey gone for the year. But probably a bigger risk is that if those bees end up in, say, a roof of a listed building, and your hive can be pinpointed as the cause of that colonization, you could end up with a bill for a stupid number. So bees on a balcony, I wouldn't suggest for a beginner. It's a little bit difficult. It's really difficult. It's something to be avoided. Now, what I can offer as an alternative to that is that I have a list of 1,500 places across the country, homeowners who have volunteered to host their hive or hives on their property suitable for beehives. So if you have 1 or 10 hives, you could stick them in either a small garden, a big garden, or a farm. And in exchange for this, there's no money that changes hands. The traditional arrangement is that you would give a small quantity of honey per hive at the end of the year. Oh, bee in the head. Okay, there's a question here about bee hotels, I think. Insect houses and bee hotels. So in the last couple of years, you've probably seen these kind of, they're kind of like wooden looking, I'm sure you've seen bee hotels. They seem to be getting very common with the county councils. Now, they look like a great idea, but I think they're maybe a terrible idea. So in nature, I don't know if I can show you something here. So say some of the bee hotels are aimed at solitary bees. Solitary bees nest in, say, the hollow stalk of something that's already died. They lay their eggs, and then the babies come out and they go off and hibernate or whatever, and the stalk will decompose and go back into the ground. Now with a bee hotel is that there's no decomposition, so the stalk, in this case the bee hotel, remains for years and years and years. Now, why is that a problem? Because if one solitary bee lays its eggs in a stalk and it has a disease, the disease goes into the ground and is destroyed or is decomposed. In a bee hotel, potentially it stays there. So the bee hotel could be a problem for vectoring disease. And disease, as with COVID, we all learn about disease, but in beekeeping, bees have diseases as well. and we have to be very mindful of the fact that we don't want to cause a problem with our good intentions. So my personal opinion is that the bee hotels might not be the best idea in the world. That instead of a bee hotel, we should be planting native plants that are suitable for our native bees to live in, as they should be. That the natural solution is the best solution in my opinion. Okay, Stina asks, how do you recognise the queen? With great difficulty. So when I'm looking through the bees, we didn't see the queen once in any of our inspections. I'm not necessarily looking for her. I'm looking for the signs that she's been there recently. So we're looking for day-old eggs. We're looking for a brood. If we see that, then we know she's probably there. We're happy enough. What some beekeepers will do is they mark the back of the queen with a dot, a coloured dot. Now the colour, there's 5 colours they use, and they each correspond to a year. So you can tell how old the queen is. Now it makes it a lot easier to spot her in 60,000 bees when you have a little red dot or a little yellow dot on her back. But it's not necessary, not hugely necessary. You don't have to do it. How do you get the red dot or the yellow dot on her back? The smart guys, what they do is when they're breeding queens, which is a kind of medium to advanced step, beekeeping, something that I've not even done yet, when the queens are they're in, basically you have control over them because you have them in a very specific spot. Once they've hatched, you can mark them then. Otherwise you're basically looking through your frames and you're looking for her. Now she is bigger than the rest of the bees, and after a while you do have an ability to spot her, but finding queens is tougher. Like I don't look for her specifically. I just look for signs of her. It's just there's no need to know she's there physically, as long as you know that the evidence of her being there is obvious. Another question here, is it hard to get the dot on her if the queen can sting you? So the queen does have a sting, but she doesn't use the sting except to sting other queens, okay? So she uses the sting usually on her sisters or her mother, okay? Now you can pick up a queen easy enough. She can sting you, but it's very rare that she will. So we don't usually actually hold her with our fingers. We use something called a queen cage. I'll show us a picture of that. And we hold her in there and we use the queen cage to mark her. Now some other people there will practice on drones. Drones don't have stingers because they don't have that part of them. Instead they have their reproductive organ in replacement of a stinger. So what beekeepers do learning is they practice on drones. Do bees recognize you, and do you have a bond with them? Modern thinking would say no. There is a traditional thought that bees do recognize you and that there is a bond. And one of the old traditions is that when a beekeeper passes away, that another beekeeper will go on the day of the funeral to the hives and tell the bees that the beekeeper has passed on. Now, do I think that bees can recognize you? I do. I actually believe that they can. And I know that because I pissed them off once and they were very angry with me for about a week. I couldn't go outside into the garden I couldn't get to the car without getting attacked because I did something wrong. My children could play in the garden, my partner could go anywhere she wanted, and she was fine. So my belief is that definitely, yeah, they can recognize you, and enough to tell that it was you that pissed them off rather than somebody else. Yeah, that's just my opinion. What I find really interesting with bees is that it's kind of like with dogs, that dogs can kind of sense your temperament, your feelings, that if you're stressed out, that kind of stresses them out and they're more likely to sting. And the more comfortable you are with being around the bees, the less likely they are to actually feel intimidated by you. If you're calm, they're calm. It's something that takes a couple of years to learn to be relaxed, and it makes it a lot easier when you're not stressed. It's a lot easier. So they're smart. How they think, how they recognize, I couldn't tell you, but there is something there that they have an ability to sense or perceive that's beyond what you'd expect. Last question here, how did I get involved in beekeeping? So long story as it always is. So my partner was making skin cream, natural skin cream, and she was using beeswax, and she was trying to use she ran out of beeswax, and she asked me to find Irish beeswax, ideally from Kildare, on the internet. So I googled for 2 days, found nothing, Ended up on a beekeeping forum on social media, asking would somebody sell me wax, honey, anything. And I ended up with a message to go to NACE on such and such a date at such and such a time. So it turned out to be a beekeeping course, a beginner's course, NACE North Kildare beekeeping course. And it just turned out to be easier just to self-supply my own beeswax by becoming a beekeeper. And it took me 2 years to be even in a position to make wax, but that was the best way for me to get involved. The best way for me to get supply was to self-supply. Stuff like beeswax is actually pretty hard to get, especially if it's to be used for something like cosmetics, because it needs to be of a certain grade. You need to know what's gone into it, you need to know how it's been treated, all this kind of stuff. So we're coming to the end of the presentation. I'd just like to give a huge thanks to the PayPal events team for coordinating this and making this happen. A good bit of technical activity was necessary on the back end to make this work, especially under current restrictions. If you'd like to learn more about beekeeping, I would suggest looking up your local association. Now, in January, I'm hoping to launch a COVID-proof digital beekeeping association. And if you would be interested in becoming a member as a beginner, you can email me at steve@swarms.ie and I'll put you on the mailing list. Thank you for learning about bees, and all the best in the future. Thank you.